So I'm very happy to welcome everybody to our first colloquium and to introduce our speaker, this young man over here, David Cassel, who many of us remember from when he was an undergraduate student here in the early 90s. And some of us remember him from even earlier in his life. And in fact, there's someone in the department who's not here today who remembers him from even before that, I believe. From even before you remember yourself, I think that Dr. Cassel remembers you. So, David was in my software engineering class, maybe one of the first ones I ever taught, I'm not sure, early 90s. Didn't cover any of the stuff he's talking about because it wasn't really well known then. So things do continue to change. That's why it's important to have colloquiums, right? David graduated in 1994 from Villanova and got his master's in computer science from Northeastern in 1996. He's currently working for Lockheed Martin, and he also is or was working on a startup. Here they come. And the lost one. So without further ado, I turn it over to David.
Thank you. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here. I've called my talk Shoestring Software Engineering. I imagine most of you students probably have taken software engineering at some point. And whenever we study software engineering, we're learning about how we should be doing software development. In some cases in business, we actually get to practice doing it that way. In many cases, in fact, my day job at Lockheed Martin, we're known for doing lots of good process stuff. We use good software engineering processes. Working for a startup, in this case, a part-time startup, has led to a lot of compromises, and so we're doing pretty much everything on a shoestring. I thought that would make an interesting topic to see the differences between how we view the ideal way to do software engineering versus what we see in practice in this particular context. So, for the plan, basically I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the company and what we're trying to accomplish. But I promise to spare you the commercial, the full business plan, all that sort of thing, unless there are any VCs in the room. I'm going to go on to some design debt that we incurred early on and how we've been working to dig ourselves out of that. Largely, we've been digging ourselves out using the model view controller pattern and by applying the Scrum methodology. I'll wrap up with some lessons that I've learned along the lines of doing this, along the course of doing this. Okay, so start off with a little bit of background. We're building a website. Saw you for that one before. The idea of it started really as a hobby, and it came about because, little things like. Today I loaned a book to my manager at work. There's a book that her daughter wanted to read, and I had a copy, so I loaned it to her. I often see my friends borrowing movies from each other. I got a Wii a little while ago. Wii is great if you get a chance to check it out. The thing is, though, for the Wii, the games are like $50 each. So it's really nice if you can borrow one of these games before you actually commit $50 to buying it. Check it out for a little while, make sure you like it, and then spend the money. I've got kids, and therefore I've got a house overfilled with toys. Instead of buying new toys every time something new comes around, it's nice every now and then just kind of borrow something instead and be able to get it back and get it out of the house when you're done with it. I also do woodworking, or I should say, did woodworking before I went back to grad school and got going on the company and all that. So anyway, I've got a bunch of tools around that I lend out sometimes, and when I'm doing a project around the house, I also want to borrow a tool. The neat thing about the street where I live is that somebody on my street owns every tool known to mankind. Now, the problem is, I don't know who to ask. When I need to borrow an oil wrench or a left-handed dingle spanner or whatever, I don't know who to ask for it. Somebody's got it. And worse, if I can find it, that person, sometimes with their responses, they don't like to lend things out because they're afraid they'll never see it again. Yeah, and I can understand that. I loan things out all the time. Often I get to see them again, largely because I decided to put this website together to address that. It provides me a way of keeping track of what I've loaned to whom and also a way to let people that I know express, what it is that they're looking for, sort of a wish list functionality. And we do all that in the context of communities. So you can put stuff online and say, these are things I'm willing to lend, but they're only visible to people that you decide to let see them. After all, we don't want people casing your house from across the internet. That would be not advantageous. All right, I mentioned that we start off with a lot of design debt. The very first example you can see is the very first user interface that I have to this website. Now, this began life as basically chapter 24 of a book, is PHP and MySQL. I didn't know how to do, well, anything on the web, including how to log in, handle sessions, that kind of stuff. So I started the source code from this book and just kind of played with it. What I got was a really boring looking interface. It did some neat stuff, but it was still really boring. There's actually something much worse here, though, than the user interface. And that's where the design debt comes around. When you look at the source code for the very first version of this website, all the functions were just global. They were just sitting around there. There was no classes or anything like that, no namespaces. PHP 4 didn't even support those. And each of those functions, they would often do things like combine. You'd have SQL statements, SQL queries, combined in the same function with stuff that's going to write out HTML to the user interface. This is not good cohesion in our software engineering terms. It's flat out ugly in more common terms. The initial source control that I was using was basically CVS running here on my laptop, which was fine to get started, but it led to a problem once I started getting some more help. I didn't have any coding standards to get started, like no naming conventions, which it's actually not quite true. I had lots of naming conventions. I had the ones that were in the book that I started with. I had the stuff that I typically use at work. I had some hybrids in between. Basically, I didn't have any naming standards. So that got messy. And for anybody who's ever done any web development, all my CSS statements were inline. I did not have an external file for that. So that got to be really messy as well. So one of the things I figured out early was I needed to recruit some help. I needed the team. So the team was a couple different developers who were also just interested in entrepreneurial stuff and had a little bit of spare time, so we got together working on it. An interesting thing happened with this. The design set problem that I've kind of been aware of got worse instead of better. Because now, instead of just me hacking with the system, I had 3 people hacking at the system, and we're all learning PHP at the time. None of us have done web development before. And we're just digging deeper on this design debt thing. So the problem continued. We started making a little bit of progress. I switched my version control to Subversion, running on a server that's in my parents' basement. Shoestring, let's see. We got
flooded?
I'm sorry?
Didn't that get flooded?
I put it up on a table. They also tend to lose power on a regular basis. One of my expenses was actually buying a battery backup to put in my parents' house to keep their network online. We shifted to PHP 5, which let us do object orientation and namespaces and that kind of stuff. So that was helpful. And I put together some directories. There we go. I put together some directories to, kind of start organizing the code a little bit. So let's take these things that are related in some way and put them in the same place so we know where to look when we're doing some kind of a change. So, progress. Actually, the change to PHP 5 was indicative of an interesting problem, which is that technology changes. Everybody in this department knows about that. When I started this was April of 2007 when I got going on this. And at the time, like, IE 6 and 7 were the dominant versions of IE, Internet Explorer. Firefox, I think 1 was still around. 2 was kind of the major one. Since then, of course, IE 8 has come out in beta. Firefox 3 is the prevalent version for that. Oh, by the way, Google's got one now. So it's one more thing to look at. So we had to make decisions about, which browsers we're going to support, what's worth the effort, and take it from there. So at some point I decided, this design debt thing is a real problem. I got to do something. I got to get serious about this. And what am I going to do to address it? Well, there were a couple things I knew I needed to do. One was to get serious about the user interface. This is the first thing that anybody sees when they come to your website or fire up your application or whatever it is you're doing. If they're not happy with the user interface, they're not going to last very long. They're probably not going to come back either. So needed to do something about that. More fundamentally, the source code itself was an absolute wreck. It was pure spaghetti code, nasty stuff. But I found a framework called KPHP that if anybody's ever done any work with Ruby on Rails, KPHP is sort of the PHP version of Rails. And that's done a really nice job of helping us organize code using the model view controller pattern. And the other major change that I put in was instituting Scrum. Scrum is an agile project management methodology that has actually had a tremendous help, I think, in just helping me keep track of what's going on and what needs to be done next, that sort of thing. So I'm going to talk about all three of those changes pretty soon, but let's start with the user experience thing here. Let me note here that I've been saying user interface up till now because that's how I've always thought about what it is you see when you fire up an application or go to a website. I learned this phrase a little while ago, user experience. You know, what's the difference? This sounds like title inflation to me. I thought about it for a bit. So, user interface is what you see. It's the color scheme. It's where you put the buttons, all this kind of stuff. It's how are they going to work with the system. This is how you get into all the Ajax-y stuff, so you've got an application that really responds to the user. It makes it much more pleasant to use. This is version 2 of the user interface, and it's still pretty lousy. I mean, anybody from 1995 would recognize this kind of approach. I got this basically by going to one of those free website builder things and kind of clicking through the wizards, and I got the template that looked halfway decent and stole the CSS from that. But it wasn't very good. So I recruited somebody to help me out with that, because I realized, you know, all right, this is just not my thing. I'm not good at user interface design, user experience design. So I got some help, and sure enough, I got somebody that's a big improvement. It's got a long ways to go, but I figured the biggest key way, the key way that I know I'm making progress on this is the version 2 of the user interface. When I had that, nobody complained about it. Oh, interesting. This, you should hear the gripes I get about this. People bitch, piss, and moan. People really complain about this. I think the difference is that now they see I'm close enough to something that's halfway decent that's worth complaining. The version 2 was so bad they just didn't think it was worth the trouble. So, all right, that's progress. I like that. I think a major takeaway for this is that maybe it's just a reminder, and maybe you may be aware of this already. So I know I'm not good at it. If you find that you are one of those, it will make you very valuable. So, with that, I'm going to move on to MVC. So the model view controller pattern. Are design patterns taught generally? Design patterns taught in?
My students are having them right now.
Great, fantastic. Good stuff. I just did a book club at my day job through that, and fantastic stuff. MVC is sort of a meta pattern. It's you get a couple of patterns, put them together, and you get this. So the basic idea of it is that we can take different parts of the functionality of a system and divide them up and put some nice clean separation between them. So as you're sitting there with your browser, you go to this one page, and let's say on my website, you want to look at the details of one of the communities. So you go to that page, and that's hitting the Apache web server. Apache web server talks to KPHP and says, here's the URL we need. KPHP takes a look at that request and says, okay, I see we've got the communities controller. That's the one I need to load up. And within that, we need the detail action. Controller and action. These are really just, a controller is a class. The action is a method within that class. And by having that, we now have a place to organize the source code that is going to respond to that request. So the inputs to this, we need to know what community is being asked for. And we also need to know who's asking, because not everybody's allowed to see the same information. So the controller now can take a look at what it's been given, what's been asked for, and turn to the model and say, model, I need to know all about this community. What can you tell me? The model takes a look and says, okay, let me go off to MySQL, my database, and it retrieves the information. And it takes a look at who's making this request, does another little check with MySQL, and says, wait a minute, this person's not actually a member of this community. All right, well, because of that, I'm not going to hand back all this data. I'm just going to hand back the title, the description, who the moderator is, but I'm not going to tell you who all the people are in this community. I'm not going to tell you what items are visible to people who are in this community, because you're not part of it, you don't get to see that. So the model selectively decides what to hand back. The controller gets that data back and hands it off to the view. The view then can take this data and just renders it, produces all the requisite HTML, JavaScript, or whatever. And that gets handed back, sent back to the browser, and voila, you get to take a look. Now the nice thing about it is that it really does a good job of encapsulating different pieces of this. So for instance, I put Amazon up there next to MySQL. One of the things I wanted with this website is I didn't want you to have to type in all the information about your stuff. It just takes too much work and nobody would do it. So instead, you type in a couple of keywords and you can pick it based on Amazon's inventory instead. It's much easier to use. The nice thing is that as far as the controller is concerned, Amazon, MySQL, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's just a data source. In fact, as far as it's concerned, it's just a model. That's all it cares about. So for the interface of the model, that stays the same if, for instance, I wanted to swap out MySQL and put in PostgreSQL, Oracle, whatever. That's a handy bit of an encapsulation. Likewise, on the views side, if so we've got the standard view with HTML and JavaScript, and that's what people expect to see. But there are other cases where I might want to be able to return data in JSON. That's JavaScript object notation. The neat thing about JSON is that you can take a bunch of arrays and objects and all sorts of things like that and convert them into a simple string, which transmits nicely across the wire. And on the other side, there's a single line command in JavaScript you can take to take the string, turn it into JavaScript objects, hence the name. That's really handy for handling AJAX responses, that sort of thing. So the neat bit about that is that I can have one view for this communities detail thing that covers HTML and a different one for JSON. And there's no difference as far as the controller is concerned or the model is concerned. They're completely isolated, and that's in one place, and I don't have to worry about it anywhere else. It turns out to be a very nice thing. This actually follows the open-close principle that we learned about in object orientation. So we can say this is open to extension but closed to modification. Like if I want to add this JSON thing, I don't have to do anything to the HTML. I don't make any changes. I don't have to worry about breaking it, which is a good thing. That's all I was going to say about that. All right, so what is the difference between that and my legacy code? I mentioned I've got this nasty spaghetti code that I've been working my way away from. So I can take my global function set, and I can have them kind of broken. In fact, I was even starting to do this. I was starting to have functions, some of which are model-oriented and some of which were controller and view-oriented. I hadn't really separated those yet. And I can have those different groups of functions. But like right now, when I take, in my legacy code, when I take a look at a function, I can see what it's called. I can see what it's supposed to do. But I really don't have any sense of the context for it. That's a problem when you go to modify something. If I want to modify this function, it's really helpful to have an idea of what is it that I might be breaking when I start mucking around with this thing. So let's see. Just lost track of something. Right. So by organizing it this way, we can get to keep track of the context, and of course, the obvious question comes up: do you need to have a framework to do this? The answer is no. If you're good enough at organizing your code, you can do it without a framework. You just do it on your own. But the thing is, you'll essentially be recreating a framework. It's obviously handy if you can take something that's already been done. Like KPHP has been out for a few years now. It's been banged on quite hard, and it's pretty solid at this point. It provides just about all the functionality you would ask for. So it gives me a great starting point, and we've been working on migrating our code over, basically a page at a time, just making things happen. Okay, so that's MVC. I'm going to move on to Scrum. So I mentioned that Scrum is an agile methodology, and so I was looking around for a good way to present this. I came across this image on the web from Conchango. It's a link down here once you get a hold of the slides. I really like this picture because it really captures the whole thing very succinctly. So what I'm going to be doing for the next few slides is kind of breaking down individual pieces of this and talking about them in detail. And in particular, how it's seen and applied at my day job, which actually has a big enough staff to do all the pieces, and how I've manualed it a bit to suit my purposes. I actually changed my day job a little while ago. Back in March, I switched from a research department where I was doing desktop applications, proof of concept kinds of things. One of the neat things about research is you need to be able to establish that the ideas work. If the software crashes, yeah, well, that's not desirable, but you can get away with it. Not so much when you're talking about an enterprise-wide website that's already in production, being used by thousands of people, intended to be rolled out to a corporation of 140,000 people. They don't like it to crash then. So switching to that group has been tremendous just in terms of what I've been able to learn both about MVC and about Scrum. So I had to focus on the Scrum roles first. So these are kind of the different roles you can play as an individual, as an employee working in a Scrum environment. The first one is the product owner. The idea of the product owner is essentially to be the customer representative. It's not practical to all the time be asking a large bunch of people, what do you think is most important to work on now? And what are the details of how we should do this? It's just not practical. So instead you have somebody represent that. And this is actually one of the key elements of Scrum is you really have to have somebody who's engaged with the development team to let them know, does this meet the needs of the customer? And this is true whether it's an internal development project like what I do with Lockheed, whether it's a website like I'm doing with a startup, or if it's a contract thing where your customer is somebody completely external. You need somebody to represent the customer to you. Product owner's job: define, prioritize, and accept the work that needs to be done. So define, of course, is just providing details on how it should look, what it should actually accomplish. Prioritize, because we're going to come back to the sprints in a little bit, but the idea is every single sprint, which in our case is 3 weeks, we're going to take a fresh look at what is the most important thing to be doing right now. You need somebody who's able to focus on what is that, and that's a big part of the product owner's job. The acceptance part is that at the end of a sprint, when the development team has finished something, is the product owner takes a look and says, yes, that meets the needs, that accomplishes what we're hoping to accomplish. Move on. Scrum Master. Scrum Master does provide some technical leadership in many cases, or others, just general leadership to the team. But a major part of the Scrum Master's job is to remove impediments. So the rest of the team, they're working away and they're trying to get stuff done. They hit a roadblock, they come to the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master's job is to make sure that roadblock gets out of the way as quickly as possible so that developer can get back to work what they're doing. So developers, using the wrong word there, I'm sorry. The team members are the ones who are actually going to make the stories happen. And often the Scrum Master is also one of the team members, of course, and may do some development work. But there's actually something really interesting about this picture. The fact that we don't see developers on this picture. We also don't see test engineers, database engineers, user experience people, or anything like that. We see team members. And that's not just a matter of saving space for the chart. That's actually a very deliberate choice. It's something that's done in Scrum that's very carefully done. For a simple reason. The idea is that when the Scrum team has its backlog, its collection of things that's supposed to work this sprint, the team is collectively responsible for working on that entire group of things. As opposed to, here's your task, you're going to work on this, here's your task, you're going to work on this. It's just not the way Scrum is supposed to operate. Now, this team is probably going to be made up of some developers and maybe hopefully a test engineer, maybe a database person, and so on. And yes, these are different skill sets capable of doing different things. But the idea, let's say we get 2.5 weeks into a 3-week sprint, and developers all finish their work around the same time, which certainly happens. They all take their things and dump it on the tester's lap 2 days before the end of the sprint. There's no way the tester is going to get through all this stuff. The idea instead is that the test engineer, the particular specialty that person has, is knowing how to test things. So that first 2.5 weeks, the tester has spent developing test plans for each of the items that needs to be tested. But those test plans can be executed by anybody. Anybody except for the person who actually wrote the code being tested. That's the idea. So that's just generally the idea that we pick up and help each other out as we're going through these different things. There are stakeholders. Hopefully, if you don't have stakeholders, you usually have a problem. These are the people providing the very high-level guidance. Here's broadly what we want to accomplish, and by the way, here's the money to go accomplish it. And then finally, there's your user community, which hopefully you're doing a good job engaging with and all that. Now, I mentioned that I've seen this work differently in the company of 140,000 people that I work with and for my startup, which has about 10 part-timers. Not surprisingly, I guess those are a little different. One interesting thing, actually, I ended up I got into this group at Lockheed by taking a product owner role. And that was kind of neat, but it was basically an excuse to get into this group because they were doing neat work. So I then started angling to something more technical, which is where I like to be, and ended up as a team member doing development work for a sprint or so. And then ended up as the Scrum Master. So I think I'm probably the only person in the entire group who's got all three of those roles. It's given me some interesting perspective on it. For the startup, let's see, I've been the product owner, the Scrum Master, a significant portion of the team members. I am the stakeholder because I'm the majority owner. And in fact, for quite a long time, I've been the only user. We haven't really started advertising yet. So basically, I started this thing because I saw a need that I wanted. I was annoyed that this site didn't exist, so I set about to create it. So for quite a while, I was basically the only one using it. So I was all five of these for quite a while. Recently, I recruited a product owner just because it just got to be too much. I needed to have somebody to kind of take some high-level guidance and go through the backlog of things and say, here's what we need to do next to execute the high-level goals. Likewise, we're working on expanding the user community. We've got additional team members now, so that's starting to help out. Scrum artifacts. The two main things I'm going to point to here are the product backlog and the sprint backlog. The idea of each of these is basically just a bucket into which we throw these user stories, as we call them, or defects, if that's appropriate. The product backlog is sort of this bucket that holds all the ideas we've had about what we might want to do with the system at some point when it gets up on the priority list. The sprint backlog is, here's what we've decided we're working on this sprint. And that's what we're going to focus on. We're not going to change that list during the sprint. We're just going to focus on that. The product backlog burn down and the sprint backlog burn down are charts that give us an idea how well we're doing with these things. So for instance, over the course of a sprint, there's this chart that basically shows time going that way, remaining hours to be worked this way. And if you think about it, in a perfect world, if we can all sit and just work on what it is we're supposed to be doing, no interruptions, which doesn't happen, of course, but all this sort of thing, and we burn down the same number of hours every day, the number of hours left is going to do that. Okay, this is called the ideal burn down. Never happens, as you might guess, but here's the thing. Over the course of a sprint, if we're seeing that the backlog, or the burn down is kind of doing this, we know very early on that we're not on track to meet this goal. We're not going to accomplish all this stuff. Likewise, if we're coming down here, we're going to run out of work to do before we get to the end of the sprint. Okay, interesting. In either case, we can adjust the amount of stuff on the backlog. We can either take the lowest priority stories and push them off, or we can take some higher priority stories from next sprint and bring them on. And we can adjust. And the beauty of that is that we very quickly come to an understanding of, are we doing well? Are we on track? This is something that I've seen time and again, and anybody who's done, large-scale software development sees. It's really easy to think you're going on track and not be. I heard it said, I wish I could remember the source, the first 90% of a software development project takes the first 90% of the time. The remaining 10% of the development takes the remaining 90% of the time. The other 90%. Yeah, that's a problem, and it happens all the time. The beauty of this is we find out really early whether we're on track or whether we're falling behind. So it's really helpful for that. The chart that's up there now is it's a screen capture from a tool called RallyDev. This is what I use for my startup to keep track of what stories we're working on this sprint. And you can actually see there's the burn down up there. Interesting thing with that, you'll notice if you look closely, it's not really going on an angle like this. Instead, our burn downs tend to look like this. The reason for that is that I mentioned before, we're all part-timers. We don't have a whole lot of time to put on this, but we do get together once a week, Wednesday nights. Whenever we get around leaving work, we'll head off to somebody's house or something, and we'll work on it hard that night. That's when all the work gets done. Most of the work gets done, and then a little bit on weekends and here and there. Excuse me. But we do get these cliff drops instead of the nice angle down. It's not ideal, but it still gives us a sense of how we're doing, so it helps. Sprint rhythm. This was the big wheel that was in the earlier chart. So this is talking about what actually happens over the course of one of these 3-week sprints. And when I say 3 weeks, I should toss out that that's not defined by Scrum. Scrum says you'll have a fixed period, and that's typically anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. I went with 3 just because that's what Lockheed was doing, and I found it easy to stick with that. But the first thing we do is we update the product backlog. So that's the product owner is taking a look at the what new stories have been thought of and what are we going to add to that. And then from there, we're going to take stories off of the product backlog and put them onto the sprint backlog. So that's the decision point of here's what we're going to work on this particular sprint. We'll have a sprint planning meeting. And the idea there is that we're going to work out a capacity number. This is how many hours of development time and testing time and such like that we have available over the next 3 weeks. And as we do our planning meeting, we're going to take each of the user stories that we put on the backlog, identify what tasks need to be accomplished to complete that story, and estimate how many hours it's going to take. When we reach our capacity, when we've estimated enough stuff that we've gotten up to our capacity number, we stop. We already know that we're doing the most important work because that was what was pulled off the backlog in the first place, the highest priority stories. So when we stop, we know that if there's anything left there, we know that the ones we're skipping are the ones of lower priority anyway. So this works really well for that. We have daily Scrum meetings and daily work. The idea there's a short meeting every day. We get together and we ask 3 questions. We kind of go around the room and it's a status from everybody to everybody. We ask, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? And do you have any impediments? As a Scrum Master at Lockheed, I usually keep this meeting about 10 minutes. It's short and sweet and get out of there and back to other stuff. But the idea simply is you're making a commitment to your fellow team members about this is what progress I expect to get done today and what I expect to accomplish for the team. You're reporting on what you do yesterday as a way of saying, I said yesterday I was going to do this and such, and here's how far I got. The impediments, of course, is just so that if there is an obstacle, you're not just banging your head against a wall in a cube somewhere. You're letting somebody know, and that needs to get out. Okay, so we get around to the right part, about 3 o'clock on this wheel. Product increment. The idea here is that at the end of a sprint, you've worked a user story, the developers have done their thing, the database engineers have made whatever updates they need, the testers have banged on it and everybody's decided this is good. Product owners have decided, yes, this meets our needs, I accept this. That means it's done. Cool. So that means we can actually release this stuff. At the end of every sprint, we have something new that we can actually put out in the production system. And we have now new functionality or fewer bugs out in the production system. That's pretty cool. Typically, this actually works a lot better for websites than it does for say, a desktop application. Because with a website, you put it out there and everybody's got your fix right away. With a desktop application, you can release it, but then you got to wait for people to download it, and so on and so forth. Moving along the clock, we have a sprint review. And this is basically just kind of reviewing for the team. Here's what we accomplished. This was good. If you have multiple Scrum teams, this is the time when Scrum Team A finds out what Scrum Team B accomplished. And so we just get that cross-team communication going. The sprint retrospective. So I mentioned at Lockheed we have a lot of software process that we do. It's often considered to be too much software process. That happens a lot of the time. Other cases, there's not enough. It can go either way. The idea of the retrospective is we get an opportunity every 3 weeks to say, this didn't work. I think we could do it better if we canceled that meeting, or if we did something different in this meeting over here, or we really need somebody to be the build manager or something like that. We get that opportunity every 3 weeks to do continuous process improvement. All right, so that's kind of the ideal sprint rhythm. That's kind of what we do when I'm doing this at Lockheed. Now, for my company, there's a little problem. We're meeting once a week. You can't really do a daily stand-up when you're meeting once a week. That doesn't work. And for that matter, there's the sprint planning meeting. At Lockheed, that's we actually have that in two pieces. There's the estimation meeting where we decide how many story points something has, and then there's the task breakdown. Between those two, you're talking 4 to 6 hours of meetings. We're getting together for 4 to 6 hours once a week. We can't do that. All right, well, that's a problem. In retrospective, we try, we chat about these things, but pretty informally. So we're taking about half of this and throwing it away. Which brings up the logical question. If I'm only using a part of this, if I'm throwing away parts of this methodology, why am I using it? Is it really giving me anything? The answer I've found has been an emphatic yes. Between my experiences with Scrum at Lockheed and my experiences with Scrum in my own company, I fear for the day when I'm going to have to work in an environment that isn't using Scrum again. I'm sure that time will come at some point. But I've got a number of reasons why I think Scrum is that much of an impact, even if you're not able to do the full-fledged thing. First reason has to do with this 3-week sprint, right? This interval. One of my motivators, in fact, my major motivation for going to Scrum for the startup was that we had a couple different projects that were large. They were big, hard things to do. Or even if they weren't that hard specifically, we knew that they were going to take a long time. And the challenge was simply knowing where we were. Where do we stand with this? We went for extended periods of time where it wasn't getting done, and it was hard to see how much progress was being made. I went to Scrum. We took these great big stories, and we broke them down into user stories, which by definition in Scrum limits you to something that you can realistically accomplish in one sprint. Okay, that makes a difference. Couple that with this idea that at the end of a sprint, the story is either done or it's not done. There is no 80% done. There is no, I think it's up to 82% now. You don't even worry about that. It is done or it's not done. It's a binary decision. If it's not done, you carry it on to the next sprint and you get back to work on it. But at least you know that you're behind now where you expected to be when you planned this out in the first place. That fact alone actually got us back on track on some of these bigger projects. In fact, the user interface overhaul to get to the version 3 of the user interface I showed you was one of these things where it was a lot of work. But putting it into stories where it says, all right, I'm going to have the new user interface on the page where I see the community detail. Okay, well, I can definitely do that in 3 weeks. So you break it all down like that, it becomes much more manageable. Second little icon there, the second little picture there is for velocity. So one of the notions in Scrum is this idea that each sprint we accomplish a certain number of story points. And I haven't really gotten into story points because I figured I wouldn't have enough time for that much detail. But we accomplish a certain number of points that kind of gives us some rough estimate of the body of work, the size of work that we accomplished in that sprint. That's good information because we're recording that number every 3 weeks. So each one of these green boxes is actually, it's a graph that shows us how many points my team accomplished in each of the last 8 sprints. And it's kind of all over the place, isn't it? Well, all right, that happens. But I can take an average of that, and I can take the high and the low. And based on those 3 numbers, I can look ahead. Let's say, the next 8 sprints, planning out a major release. And I can have some idea how much we're likely to be able to accomplish. That's pretty cool. When we do our planning with Gantt charts, which many projects do, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Gantt charts or not, but anyway, a more traditional method anyway. it becomes much harder, I found, to look at, well, here's how far we've gotten, and I can see there's this much schedule slip or this much accomplished, whatever. It's much harder to take that kind of data and project out into the future. Scrum really makes that easier by just giving you a set of numbers that acknowledges from the very beginning are approximate. And that's okay. This whole this whole story points thing is a very deliberate approximation. Okay, the product increment. So I was talking about that a little bit on the sprint rhythm. This notion that every sprint we have something that is now releasable to production. So one of the blogs that I tend to read, and this guy provided me a lot of inspiration to get going on this, is a guy named Paul Graham. And Paul Graham, he's actually one of the earlier web entrepreneurs, made his millions selling his company via web to Yahoo, which is now Yahoo Stores. One of the things he talks about is get something out. Get your version 1 as quickly as you can, understanding that it's not going to be that pretty. It's not going to have the full functionality. Get it out. Once you've got something out, work to continuously improve it. His contention, and I'm inclined to believe this, is that users who go to a website and see, well, this is kind of a neat website, it doesn't do everything I like, but it's kind of helpful. If they see that it's continuously improving, if it's getting regular updates and getting better and better, they're going to be a lot more forgiving, certainly compared to a site that they don't even see because you're determined to perfect it before you release it. And even before a website where you put up something and then wait a long time before you do any changes to it. So this idea of continuous improvement to the website can make a big difference in terms of getting people to actually say, this might be worth checking out. I'll keep coming back and enjoy that it's getting better as we go. The box on the lower right is about prioritization. And I already mentioned this a little bit, but just the idea that every 3 weeks we're going to revisit the question of what is the most important thing to work on right now. Typically, software projects are planned out months in advance, sometimes years in advance. And the trick with that is you often spend a lot of time doing design and planning work for stuff you later end up de-scoping. You don't have time for it, or the priorities change, or whatever. So we got this notion of kind of just-in-time planning, right? We're going to get to the beginning of the sprint, and only then are we going to think about what exact tasks we have to accomplish to do this. Only then are we going to think about how we actually design this particular feature to go into the system. Up until then, we've got this general notion, we know what we need to accomplish. We've got an order of magnitude understanding of how much work it's going to be. Once we have that, we're just going to set it aside, we'll come back to it later. That's great for just not wasting time. And like I said, for software projects that I've seen where the planning is done at a much higher level, I've run a couple of internal research projects at Lockheed where you're expected at the beginning of the year to have a plan for the entire year. Usually it doesn't take more than a couple months before it's pure fiction. So it's nice to just forget about that completely in the beginning and move on. The dog here is, the idea there is just we're thinking about good and bad all the time. At the end of every sprint we do this retrospective. And the idea of the retrospective is we have this opportunity to say, what did we do well? What was good? Let's make sure we keep doing that. What didn't work so well? Where can we improve? All right, let's actually improve. Let's do something different and get us to somewhere better. And having that opportunity is really nice. Again, for a lot of larger projects I've seen, well, number one, if you get to a large project, the people who can make the decisions don't often have enough visibility down to the trenches where we're actually getting stuff done to even know what needs to change. There typically are not paths of communication to get those change suggestions back up. With Scrum, you do. That's a part of the definition of Scrum. You do these retrospectives, and that information gets communicated back up.
So, David, you're not trying to make a political statement by the choice of color there?
By the choice of color? Oh, no politics here.
All
I didn't think about that.
right.
I don't think I would have changed it if I had, but I'm
Angels
sorry.
and dragons to me, but I don't know.
Pure coincidence, I assure you. All right. On this, a couple lessons learned. One of the first things that I realized about doing this was the importance of understanding design debt. Now, Design debt, as I've described it, probably sounds like a bad thing. You know, you're making these shortcuts. You're not doing the proper design or this, that, the other thing that you know you really ought to be doing. I think it's sometimes it's okay to have design debt. It's not necessarily bad if you know you're doing it, and if you have an understanding of when you're going to need to pay it back and plan for it. As long as you do that, it's okay to carry some design debt. It's when you get to the point where you're not even realizing how much you have because you're not making conscious choices about it. And then when you do realize it's this massive crushing load, that's a problem. So my lesson on this was that basically the moment you decide that this isn't just a hobby, it's not just something you're messing around with as a brief little thing, but rather that you want to make this into a larger system, that's probably the time to start thinking consciously about, you know, where is my design, how good is it, and do I need to be doing something better? It's a good time to look at frameworks, for instance. If I had gotten into that stuff earlier, I'd probably be completely ported over to KPHP by now instead of just kind of doing it piecemeal as I get a chance. The user experience, I talked before about this is a skill that's not very common, but it is very, very valuable. So, like I said, if you're somebody who does that well, then cultivate that by all means. The user interface that I started with was just bad. It was a problem, and I've made a lot of progress on it since then. And like I said, I'm now up to the point where I'm getting complaints about it, and that's progress. So I actually recently recruited a guy whose professional full-time thing is user experience design. I've got high expectations for where that can go. And in fact, the fact that I have that now, coupled with the fact that I'm using MVC, means that when he suggests changes, I actually know where to go to do them. I have that well encapsulated now. It's going to be a lot easier to do those changes than it was when I did the first couple rounds on the user experience, user interface. The team, a little bit about the team. So the major takeaway I think from the team, and this might be apparent, it might be self-obvious kind of thing, but it's important to know your weaknesses. I think that's something most people could agree with. Once you understand what your weaknesses are, the next step is to actually do something about them. So you got a couple choices there. When I started doing this, the only web development I had ever done before was writing up some HTML in a simple text editor way back my first time in grad school. That was not good experience for teaching me how to do this. I've read books. I switched my day job to match this. I dived into it and just kind of got to know how to do it. That's one way to address a weakness. You can just apply yourself and teach your way out of it, learn your way out of it. Another way is to surround yourself with the right people. Get your team built to compensate for your weaknesses. For instance, I'm bad at user experience design. I've got a guy for it. On the business side of things, I'm not real great with business stuff. And more importantly, I don't really want to be. I mean, I recognize the importance of it. It's critical. If you don't have a good business plan, you don't have anything. That's business plan in lowercase letters, not capital letters. You don't necessarily have to have a written out thing. But you got to know how it is you plan to make some money on this thing, or you're just wasting your time. I have the kind of the high-level vision stuff on that, the details. I recruited a guy for that. I recruited a guy, made him my CEO, and said, just figure it out. Let me know. One person asked me, so you're the majority owner, he's the CEO, and you're also a developer. When you disagree, how does that work out? We just negotiate. It works out. It's fine. Right, so surrounding yourself with the right people. And actually, that was another part of when I switched my day job to a more web-oriented thing. Part of that was I switched from a research group where basically everybody senior to me was a principal investigator. Right, so somebody's running running research projects. They've got all the thoughts and crazy ideas about what the customers are going to want 5, 10, 20 years from now. Everybody junior to me was a developer. So I'm kind of in the middle. The downside of that means it's kind of hard to learn. There are certain things you can learn from people junior to you, of course, but you learn a lot more from people who know more than you. And in particular, since what I wanted to learn was software development, and that's not what the PIs were good at, I did not have a real rich environment for learning. When I switched to this other group that was doing web development, now I'm surrounded by people who know vastly more about web development than I do. And as a result, I have learned more in the last 6 months than I can learn in years otherwise. It's huge to do that sort of thing. And finally, Scrum. For me, like I said, I dread the day I'm going to have to do more work that's not under Scrum or something similar to that someday in the future. But just having some way, whatever works for you, whatever method, you need to have some way to kind of organize yourself, organize your team, and organize your work. Because otherwise, what you end up with is everybody just says, well, I think this will be interesting to work on. I'm just going to play with that for a while. And you need to have some way of kind of channeling this energy, channeling the team into working on stuff that really drives the whole system toward a goal. Because, yeah, you know, it would be great if we had the Facebook application we're planning on doing. We want to have a Facebook interface to this whole website. That would be great. But wouldn't it be nice if the website itself worked first? Let's start with that. So that's that whole priority thing and getting those kind of details worked out. Okay, almost done. What is the hard part? I have a little bit of a clue up here, right? Obviously, it's the money, right? I'm starting a startup, and you got to have some money. Where's, get the venture capitalists? Not really. At least not for me. This is the beauty of it. Starting a company today, doing web development, for instance, or technology in general, it's amazingly cheap. It really is amazing. I think altogether I've spent not more than about $500 if we don't count the $2,400 laptop that I use in my company as an excuse to convince my wife to let me buy. If we don't count that, then I haven't spent very much at all. My web host, I'm paying like $5 a month. It's nothing. It's a little bit of money to the state to register the company, things like that. Money should not be the obstacle. That's good. What is the obstacle? Time. I look at my competitors' sites and I can just feel.
How are you paying the developers with?
Equity. Equity. The grand total revenue I brought in on the site so far is about $50. Yeah, they got tired of getting paid, like in pennies. So, basically what I'm doing is just handing out equity. That is the only realistic way to do it at this point. So, and I'm actually glad you brought that up. This is another point I picked up from Paul Graham. Simple question. Would you rather own 100% of something that's worth nothing, or a smaller percentage of something that's got a shot at being worth a lot? That's not a hard question. So I am perfectly happy to give away parts of my company, ownership of my company, to other people who are going to help me actually make it worth something. It doesn't do me any good. It doesn't do me any good to make it, to have all the company that doesn't go anywhere. So my real problem is time. Every time I look at my competitors' websites, I can just kind of feel the time melting away. So what is the problem with time? Well, a couple things. A couple of us have families. I like to remember what my wife and kids look like occasionally, and one of the other developers has a family as well, kids. You people might find this hard to understand, but some of these people enjoy being in grad school. And so, I got a couple guys taking classes, including one who's actually working on preparing to teach a class. So that obviously has an impact on the available time. And of course, there's the minor detail that I'm not paying anybody, including myself. We all still have bills to pay. We're working a full-time job and then doing this on the side. So that whole time thing becomes a real challenge. So I can kind of cheat and revise my earlier answer. Money can be an obstacle or not, depending on how much time you have available. What it comes down to is the most precious commodity trying to do this is time. Now, if somebody wrote me a check for whatever, enough money that I could quit my job and work on this full time, hey, I'd be, making much more progress on this, and that'd be cool. That takes money, which means giving up equity, and there are always trade-offs with that. So, it's one of these things where time really is the critical resource. And since money equals time at some level, you can call the obstacle money or you can call it time, depending on how you want to look at it. Okay, the website is tros.com. Anybody wants to take a look, I'd be happy to hear your feedback. That's as much of a commercial as I'll give you. I'll keep it good. I put up links to Paul Graham's site. He's got a bunch of essays there, which I've found really fascinating, inspiring reading. Guy Kawasaki is another guy I've been reading a lot of his blog. He's been an entrepreneur. His resume includes being an Apple evangelist. He's just got all kinds of neat things to say too. And with that, I'm going to open up to questions if anybody's got any.
just had a quick question on your testing. Like when you reorganized your code, did you do or set up any automated test then? And if you didn't, do you have it now so that at the end of the cycle, the testing time is reasonable?
Okay. Can everybody hear the questions, or should I repeat them?
From your child?
Okay. So the question is, given that we're doing all this stuff with all the development, do we have an automated testing setup as part of our environment? The answer is no, tragically. This is something I keep every couple of weeks. I grouse and moan about how I just really got to set up a good, automated testing system. Ironically, my legacy code had more unit tests built into it than my current stuff, because I got to the point where I was getting frustrated with the spaghetti code. It means brittle code, which means bugs, and I was getting tired of that. So I started building in some unit tests that I could just script and run automatically using a framework called PHP Unit. It's similar, related to JUnit and those sorts of things. KPHP has an automated testing setup built into it using a different framework that I've just not gotten around to exploring. And I keep telling myself that any day now I'm going to get around to doing that. And it kills me, honestly, because I know the importance of it and I really do value it. And it's one of these...
You have a lot of code to deal with.
There is a lot of code.
It's easier when you just started with the model.
Yeah, it is certainly easier to begin with a small set up your unit test for that, and then grow as you go. The one positive side of that has been that since I moved into KPHP, the code has actually become much more reliable just because of how well it's organized. So I'm actually finding fewer bugs, and when I make changes, I break fewer things than I used to, even when I had some unit tests built in. And actually, the testing thing brings up one other interesting point, which is I even mentioned earlier that developers shouldn't test their own code. This is a common rule. Because basically you're going to be number one, you'll be more understanding about problems in your own stuff, because you know how hard you worked on it.
Wait a second, they should test it.
Well, I'm sorry, they should not be the last person to test it. Thank you. Yes, they should test it. So one part is that they'll be more forgiving. Another part is that when you test the stuff that you develop, you're probably going to test it the same way you've been testing it all along. Whereas another person steps in, they're going to run through the various steps differently and find different problems. Most of this work, like I've probably been the developer for, I don't know, some large percentage, let's call it the majority and leave it at that, of the code that's in there currently. And I'm also the lead tester. So, I know that a fair number of the bugs that are in there because nobody else looked at it. We actually have an integration environment. So when we check things in, it automatically gets built to another server. This is one at my parents' house. And we can take a look at it there to see how well my changes meshed with your changes before we actually put it up into production. It's helpful, but only if somebody else looks at it. So that's actually something I'm looking for my new product owner to help out with. It helps that she's actually a professional tester during the day. Counting on her to be much less forgiving.
You've been very eloquent about the virtues of Scrum, and I'm listening to that about product increments and retrospectives. And the question that occurs to me is there any tension there about maintaining design coherence or discipline?
So the question is there a problem with maintaining design coherence or discipline, given that we're doing these, everything is broken down into these small stories that we do sprint to sprint.
With the backlogs that you can add to as well as take things out of, right?
Mm-hmm. So are you asking about how does one govern the architecture of a system given all these, that we're doing everything in small pieces, that sort of question?
I'm just asking about whether you've encountered any challenges along those lines
Of putting things in and taking things out of the backlog. So it certainly happens that sometimes we'll get started on something because it looks interesting or it looks like a good change to do, and then for one reason or another we realize that either we can't do this right now, or it's not desirable to do this right now, or just something else comes up. If I'm working away on something and we realize, you know what, there's this critical problem on the website, all of a sudden people can't log in anymore. Whatever I'm doing, I'm dropping it, I'm fixing that. At Lockheed, we refer to that as Sev2, severity 2 bugs that come in. We assign a severity to each defect that comes into the system. We do this on our website too. So severity 1 means basically nobody's going home until it's fixed. Severity 2 is it's not that bad, but it needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. Anything that's severity 2 or higher, you pretty much drop whatever you're doing and get to work on that and roll it out as soon as it can be managed. And that obviously is going to take precedence over any new features or even over lower priority defects. So there is, even though the Scrum literature usually actually says that there's a commitment made in the beginning of the sprint that here are the stories, this is what we're working on, and that's the end of it. And if the customers want to come up and say, we really like whatever, the answer is go away. We're not talking to you until the sprint's over, at which point you may tell us whatever you like about what you'd like us to work on next. For now, we have this carved in stone, go away. That's basically what it says in the Scrum literature. In practice, you got to be more flexible than that, or agile, so to speak.
I think any further questions? I think David would be happy to address. We'll be meeting down in the library / lunchroom immediately afterwards. Thank you very much.